Hi everyone, in this short presentation I'm going to be talking about the idea of voice in academic writing. I think supervisors often use the term voice to give feedback to students, and it's not always clear what it means, particularly because the word voice is used in ordinary English to sort of talk about being passionate, or having a beautiful singing voice or whatever else. And so it's not really clear what it means in academic writing. So I'm going to go through a few slides and just talk through what I think it means. To begin with, I want to reiterate something I've often said in my presentations, and that is that there's no such thing as academic writing. And I think that this is very poorly understood. So there is this general idea that you just have to become good at academic writing, whereas different forms of academic writing serve very different purposes. And even within one field, you may write a research report, a research article, a newspaper article, and each of those will require quite different forms of writing. And then, of course, different disciplines are constructing different forms of knowledge, and so they will require very different approaches to academic writing. So, for example, if we have a look at these two texts, I can tell you quite truthfully that I cannot even recognize more than one or two words. The one on the left is from 2014 and it's written in English, and the one on the right is from 300 BC and it's written in Greek. But the truth is, the one on the left is just as confusing to me as the one on the right, because it is being written for people within that particular field. It is not being written for me. So it's perfectly good academic writing. I think I'm quite good at academic writing, but I cannot make sense of this article on the left, even though it's supposedly written in a language in which I think I am fairly strong. So if we have a look at the bottom there, it's literally using Greek signs and symbols that are very much part of the way of communicating within many fields in the natural sciences, such as physics and mathematics. If I have a look at that sentence there, the second order linear homogeneous differential equation. Now, each of those words individually I could probably kind of make sense of, but even though I understand them each individually, I don't understand what a second order linear homogeneous differential equation is. So to say that you're good at academic writing is, or conversely, to say that you're bad at academic writing doesn't really make sense, because there wouldn't be a single human being on the planet who is good at all forms of academic writing. Because to become good at academic writing is to become adept within a field. It is to understand the concepts, the theories, the thinking, the values, the norms, the kinds of knowledge in a specific field. That is what it takes to become good at academic writing. I've just chosen a few extracts from journal articles that are all about coronavirus to just again illustrate this idea that different disciplines have very different forms of academic writing because they are trying to communicate very different forms of knowledge. So here we've got one that starts, in order to identify SARS-CoV-2 neutralizing antibodies, ELISA cross-reactivity was assessed of antibody containing supernatants of a collection of 51 SARS-S hybridomas derived from immunized transgenic H2L2 mice that encode chimeric immunoglobulins with human variable heavy and light chains and constant regions of rat origin. Supplementary table 1. I understand the word mice. That's about it. What's interesting, I think, to see here is that in this particular kind of academic writing, the authors do not insert themselves in the writing. So it says the cross-reactivity was assessed. It doesn't say who it was assessed by. It just miraculously happened. It was assessed. And the reason that we write in this way in these particular disciplines is to establish that the claims that we are making are objective and external to ourselves as fallible human beings. We don't write in these kinds of fields in ways that consider our political views, our upbringing, our life experiences, our gender, our sexuality, our race, our age. All of these things should have no bearing on the validity of the claims we're making. And to symbolize the objectivity of the claims we're making, we take ourselves completely out of the writing. So we say something was assessed. We don't say, I assessed it or we assessed it. There's also, here's another example, the recombinantly expressed human 47D11 was used for further characterization. So it just was used. It doesn't say who did it or why they did it or how they decided to do it or whether they first did something else and that was a mess up and so they did it again. They extricate themselves and all the human fallibility outside of the writing. And very typically in this kind of writing, there would also be a lot of appendices, supplementary tables, graphs, numeric data that would be presented to the readers to ensure that the voice of the authors are taken seriously because the empirical data is provided for the reader. So in this writing, although the authors do not put themselves in the writing or give any of their personal views, there is still a thing called voice. And the voice in this particular writing is very strong. And really what voice means is the ability to make credible claims supported with valid evidence. That is a strong voice, but that looks very, very different in different fields. So in this case, the voice, which as I've defined as the ability to make credible claims substantiated with valid evidence, this is exactly what the authors have done. They've made credible claims and they have given evidence to support those claims that would be considered valid within that particular field. And so there's a strong voice. And here's another example. Here it starts off with the word people, so we are really getting much more focus on human beings with all the complexities of research involving human beings. It's very different from the previous piece of research because in a previous piece of research you can do it in a laboratory, you can count and measure every variable, at least that's what scientists try to do, is to establish every variable at play and measure it or control it. Whereas when you're dealing with humans, people with psychiatric conditions or substance use disorders, you're going to be talking about, they're not in a laboratory. You're not going to be able to control everything that leads humans to have psychiatric conditions or substance use disorders. So it's a different kind of knowledge. But in this particular piece of writing, they are putting themselves in the writing. If you have a look at what's circled there now, they are saying we extend this work. So they don't say, as in the previous case, this work was extended. They are putting themselves in the writing in a way that signals an awareness that the researchers, to some extent, have influenced what is being discussed and found here. The level of objectivity is not as strong as in the previous sense. And this is actually shown by the authors, including a recognition that they have made decisions in the process. You'll notice, though, that the referencing here is by footnote, which is, they're very different referencing styles, and often I think people think that these styles are purely technical, but actually they relate the kind of referencing style that is used and the way in which those referencing styles emerged over decades relates to the kinds of voice, the kinds of knowledge, the kinds of claims being made. And so in this case, it's a footnote, which again takes people somewhat out of the writing, because it's not telling you that Tandeka and Keyes 2017 argued that this is a particularly high-risk subgroup. Instead, it's just putting a footnote, and you can then follow that footnote to go and track that evidence, because the referencing is there to provide evidence for the claims that the authors are making. So you can track that footnote, but they haven't actually put it in the writing. And now let's have a look at another one. And this example is very, very different indeed. This example, it's still academic writing and it's published, peer-reviewed, but it's very much at the other extreme. where the nature of the knowledge is so subjective, it so emerges from the author's life experiences that the author not only puts herself in the writing, she actually spends some time talking about herself. So it starts off, I am a psychotherapist at a major hospital in rural New England. She's justifying the rights, the experiences she has, the basis on which she's making certain claims. So it's her life experience that allows her to make certain claims. And so she explains that life experience. And then she says, I can't help but reflect on the stories of my patients amid the coronavirus pandemic. A very personal, reflective account. Later on in this article, she does indeed draw on the literature, refer to the literature to substantiate the claims that she's making. But at the beginning of the article, she's really writing using personal experience as the substantiation of claims. And this would not be acceptable in many fields. It would not count as valid knowledge. So when I say that voice is the ability to make valid claims that supported by evidence that's considered credible, well, what counts as a valid claim and what counts as a suitable form of evidence to support that claim varies significantly from field to field. So your voice will look different in different fields. So academic writing often feels very mysterious, like there's some kind of weird code that you have to crack. And in many ways that's true, because unfortunately many of us academics and supervisors, we teach as if there's only the content. There's only the facts of the fields that need to be understood. But in fact, the way in which we write about the content, the structure of that content, the way in which we disseminate it through writing, all of that varies significantly from discipline to discipline because of the value systems of different disciplines. This is a bit of a crude table because, of course, the nature of knowledge is far messier than a simple table would suggest, but it might be useful for you to think about the field that you're working in and to think where you fit along each of these continua. They should actually be continua with arrows in between. On the one hand, you might be working in a very objective field, like that very first example, where knowledge is considered to be outside of the researchers. Or you might be working in a very subjective field, where knowledge is understood to be biased, to be subjective, to emerge from who we are and what our experiences are and where our expertise comes from. And so that writing would be far more reflective about how our own positionality and experiences may have impacted on the claims that we're making. To look at the second continuum, you may be working in a field where knowledge is understood to be rule-bound, where the purpose of knowledge is to establish those rules and principles and to figure out the boundaries of those rules and what those rules explain. And that's the reason why we are trying to do experiments that allow us to develop theory in the form of formulas that can then be applied to different contexts. So very rule-bound knowledge. On the other extreme, you may be working in a field where knowledge is understood to be experiential, a very constructivist or postmodern fields, where knowledge is understood to be constantly fluid and shifting and dependent on who is telling us about that knowledge. The idea that knowledge is created by humans and therefore changes over geographies and over time. You might be working, to look at the third continuum, with the idea that one should try and establish very generalizable forms of knowledge, so that once we figure out something that works in one laboratory, we should get exactly the same results if we repeat the experiment in another laboratory. There may be limitations that will be spelt out in the rules about whether this can be, can this be generalized across larger quantities or different kinds of chemicals or what have you. But the more generalizable the rule is, the stronger the rule is believed to be. On the other extreme, we may see our knowledge as highly contextual. So the claims we are making we might not be, as researchers, trying to say that this is how tutorials will work in Russia and how they will work in Romania. We're just trying to say this is how the tutorials worked at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. So we might see knowledge as highly contextual and as emerging from the nature of the particular contexts. Because the nature of knowledge varies so much, our literacy practices, in other words, the ways of reading, the ways of writing, the ways of disseminating knowledge, the ways in which we use voice, the nature of voice, will look different because of the differences in the nature of knowledge. Because our literacy practices emerge not from the rules of English or whatever medium of instruction, your medium of teaching and learning you're using. Believe it or not, the grammar and spelling and punctuation rules of English have very little to do with the reading and writing that we do in the academy. So the literacy practices that we use emerge from the nature of knowledge. And so given that there are these continuums that I've been talking about around different forms of knowledge, so you're going to have very different literacy practices. For example, you might have, as I showed in those earlier slides, the kinds of fields that would have third-person passive voice. 5 milliliters of water was titrated, if that's a correct statement. Who titrated it? We don't say. We take ourselves out of the writing to show that the knowledge is objective and rule-bound and generalizable. But on the other extreme, we might find if we're dealing with knowledge that's very subjective, shifting, contextual, or somewhere along that continuum, we might find that we use more first person in our writing. I did this. We tried that. And often there may even be a need for a narrative around your positionality. Who are you? And how might who you are affect the data that you're able to collect and the way that you've analyzed it? Might it lead to people in interviews speaking to you in a particular way because you are a lecturer in the university or whatever it might be, or you are a doctor interviewing patients? Would that power differential affect the way in which they describe their pain to you? So you might actually describe the fact in your writing. You might actually have to describe who you are and how that might affect the study. To look at the next example of how literacy practices emerge from the nature of knowledge, on the one extreme, the references would only be found in the literature review. If you're working in the kinds of knowledge that's subjective, rule-bound, generalizable, you're likely to have references in the literature review, the section where you map out the field and you tell us what has been done before your study in this particular area. Those references, therefore, show a body of work. And often it'll be very person distant, so it might be with footnotes, or it might be in brackets with just the person's surname. But you're much less likely to say Tandeka Keys found that. You're more likely to say the antibodies are effective in 99% of cases. Footnote number 1. And you go to the footnote and you see that it was Tandeka Keys who found that. So you extricate not only the authors of this piece yourself, you often even extricate the authors that you're referring to, the referencing style that you use. And those references are only found in the literature review. At the other extreme of the continuum, you'll find that the references in the more humanities, social sciencey kind of research there'll be references in the introduction, there'll be references in the literature review, there'll be references in the methodology, there'll be references in the findings and discussion section. And the reason those references are given throughout is because of the contested nature of those fields. So in my methodology, I don't just say I did focus groups. I'll refer to someone else to substantiate my claim that focus group was the appropriate methodology to use to collect data, because that's contested. My reader might say, focus groups? Why did you use focus groups? Why didn't you use interviews? So I'm using the literature as a means of substantiating my claim. And that's my way of having a strong voice. I make a claim about the methodology I used, but I refer to the literature to show that my choices were strong and good and valid. And then the third sort of continuum of literacy practices, there are many, but the third one I'm going to discuss here, is that typically in your literature, you'll be trying to establish a clear gap, and you'll delimit that gap. So you'll say no one has done this particular experiment using these sample sizes or this particular chemical or what have you. Whereas the literacy practices on the more right-hand side of that continuum, it's more, a lot of the process of talking about the literature and the problem, we'll be talking about the context in which the study's done. It'll be a rich description of why this context needs to be studied and how the findings may emerge from this context. And so there'll be express constraints on the extent to which your readers can just generalize your findings. So hopefully that's a quick example of how the nature of knowledge varies significantly from field to field, and therefore the nature of how we read and write about that knowledge varies significantly from field to field. And that, I want to argue, is the reason why voice looks different in different fields. Most of these weird aspects of academic writing, which emerge from hundreds of years of histories of different disciplines, are there for a good reason. They emerge because of the nature of knowledge of that field. And we've got to remember that academic writing, the purpose of academic writing, typically, if it's in a specialist journal article, for example, it's about dissemination of knowledge to other people in the field. It's a conversation between members of a particular discipline. We as a rule, I think we have a responsibility as researchers to be disseminating our work through newspaper articles and workshops and so on to the general population. I think that's a really important job of all scientists. But when we are writing academic writing within our discipline, we're talking to other members of our discipline. And so it makes sense that we would be using very complex terminology, that what we call semantic density, using a term from legitimation code theory, that each term that we use is packed with meaning for other insiders. So I don't need to explain what antibodies are. I'm sure that it would take 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 pages to explain what antibodies are. But because I'm talking to other people who are in the field, I can just write antibodies. And that semantically dense term might exclude others from making sense, and it may make novices to the field think that, oh, this is all jargon and complicated, and why are these people just showing off? But actually, it's mostly there to make sure that we can write in a concise way and we can get on with the business of building knowledge because we're speaking to others in the field who understand it. Having context may also be very invisible, depending on what kind of knowledge it is. I don't need to explain that this was done in a laboratory in Eswatini. I can just get on with explaining what was done. But on the other hand, context may be absolutely vital to the kinds of claims I'm making. So a strong voice may require detailed description of who the participants are and what their worlds are like. It depends on the nature of the knowledge. And the decisions that a researcher makes may be almost invisible. We can just say, this was done, because there's general agreement in the field about how one should go about making knowledge in this particular area. On the other hand, if there's lots of contestation, why did you do focus groups instead of interviews, for example? If these kinds of choices are all still up for grabs and still debated in the field, then we may need to explicitly articulate why we did what we did. We may need to reflect on the mistakes that we made along the way. It depends on the nature of the knowledge. So if you're wanting to get a strong voice and be good at academic writing, you've got to figure out how people do things in the discipline. You've got to, you're joining a conversation, and you don't just barge into a room where people have been talking for a long time and just start, sort of spouting out your views. You would take some time to figure out who's in the room, what have they been saying, what are their opinions. You certainly within your rights to contradict what others have said in the discipline, just like you can contradict someone in a conversation. But if you're walking into a room where a conversation's been happening for quite a while, don't just walk in talking. Walk in, sit down, and listen for a while. And that metaphor is about spending your time reading the conversation around the phenomenon that you're researching. How have people been doing this research? And read at the level of understanding concepts and knowledge, but also try and read at a kind of meta level where you start to try and figure out why are they writing it in this way? Why are the references in this style? Where are the claims that this author is making? And what evidence are they giving the reader to substantiate their claims? How are they developing a strong voice? And sometimes reading in that way will help you to take on the disciplinary voice as well. You also need to decide if the historical ways of doing things are valuable. As much as I've been arguing that most of them emerge from the nature of the knowledge, and you need to figure that out before you rush in and discard them or critique them, there definitely are ways of doing things and disciplines that are simply historical and that perhaps are dated, perhaps only serve some people more than others, and that really should be challenged. Because there is no doubt, and I'm looking at you, humanities, social science, and commerce, and these are my people, so I can critique them. There's no doubt that some of our writing is pretentious and exclusionary nonsense, and it really needs dismantling. There are times when we try and use fancy language to sound fancy rather than focusing on how best to disseminate the knowledge and get the message across. So I think there's a real role for critiquing some of our historical norms and values and literacy practices. I think it's really important to know that anyone can get good at academic writing. Some of you might not believe me, but I've been in this business long enough to say with confidence, anyone can get good at academic writing. And I often hear students saying, I'm not good at academic writing, or even worse, I hear them say, I'm not a good academic writer. And I want to say, no, you just haven't done enough of it. It's a social practice. It emerges from social norms and values. It isn't a God-given ability that you were born with. It is a social practice. And so because it's made by people, people can get good at it, but they need practice. It is only through practice that you can get good at academic writing. It's not a language skill. I don't want to deny, and this is a topic for another day, but I don't want to deny the extent to which reading and writing in a language that is not your home language really doubles the burden. If most reading and writing in academia is in English, if English is not the language that you speak at home, it is definitely an additional challenge. But it is not about being good at English that makes you a good academic writer. I want to say that again. It's not being good at English that will make you a good academic writer. You may be very confident and fluent in your speaking, but actually really battle with academic writing. And the reason for that is that academic writing, there's no such thing. There's only the academic writing of a particular discipline. And until you are steeped in the understandings, the concepts, the theories of that discipline, you cannot be good at academic writing in that discipline. It's not language per se that you have to get good at. It's the discipline. And this takes effort and practice. You can't get good at academic writing unless you're doing lots of academic writing. Lots and lots of academic writing. It's literally the only way to get good at it. Remember that you're contributing to knowledge. You may think that you're writing a thesis or you're getting a publication, but those are simply the means to the end. The end, the goal, the target, the purpose is to contribute to knowledge. Focus on that side of the purpose more than focusing on getting a publication or getting the chapter written. And think about, what knowledge am I trying to disseminate? What am I trying to tell my reader? What will my reader need to know? That is how you will get a strong voice. Thinking about your contribution and thinking about your reader. Try and avoid thinking about the means, which is just writing a thesis or getting a doctorate. Those are just the process. The real goal is to contribute to knowledge. Very importantly, the only way to get to good writing is through bad writing. There are no shortcuts. You have to be willing to do bad writing. Lots and lots of bad writing. Because if you sit down and want to do good writing, and it's your first draft, it's your first attempt, you will paralyze yourself. You will write one sentence and you'll correct that sentence and you'll shine that sentence and you'll delete that sentence and you'll write that sentence again. You've got to write lots and lots of bad writing before you can hone the craft of having a strong voice and doing a piece of good writing. The amount of bad writing you have to do becomes less and less as you get better and better at academic writing in your discipline. But when I sit down and write a journal article, I still have to do bad writing. My first few drafts, I have to be kind to myself. I have to say, let me just get this down on paper. Let me just write to figure out what the heck I think. And then I'll hone it and craft it until I think that it's good enough to submit for publication. You've got to do the bad writing before you can do good writing. So you're joining a conversation, which means you need to know what the conversation is about, which means that you can't be writing for other people until you've done a lot of reading of what other people in your field have said. You've got to read and read and read and read and read. And this is those of you in academia. If you want to be an academic, you better love reading and writing. And you might not love it just yet, but it kind of grows on you. The more reading and writing you do, the more confident you become at it, the more easy it becomes. You still have to do the bad writing, but not quite as much of it. But you're joining a conversation. So figure out what that conversation is. Steep yourself in that conversation. You're a novice member of a group of people who've been creating knowledge in that field for decades or even centuries. And you're coming in and you're doing your bit. You're contributing a piece. And we should all be very grateful that you're doing that, because that's how knowledge is built. It's little piece by little piece as people join the field and participate in the conversation. So you have to do loads and loads of reading, but for every reading there must be a writing. This is something I say to my students all the time. That writing doesn't have to be fancy good writing for someone else, for your supervisor, for your publisher, for your examiner, for your peer reviewers. No, most of the writing will just be for yourself. But every time you do a reading, jot down some notes for yourself. What was that reading about? What did you enjoy about it? What did you hate about it? What do you need to follow up on it? What are the ideas that that are put into your head? And most importantly, how did what you just read relate to the knowledge contribution that you want to make? How might that reading work as a substantiation for the claims that you're going to make? So keep a reading journal. Do lots of writing, scribbled, messy writing about what you're reading. So it's taken me a long time to get to this idea of what is voice. Let me see if I can go a little bit faster. Many people think that voice means saying I this or I that, I think that, I believe that, but that's not the case at all. In fact, sad to say, we don't care what you think or believe. Your views are unlikely to hold much weight in an academic text, and nor are mine. In a dinner party conversation, you may hold sway by saying, I think. But in an academic text, your thoughts or beliefs are not what we're interested in. So voice is not about opinion. Voice is not about your views. Voice is the authority with which you make your claims. So in academic writing, we want to have an authoritative voice. We want to have convincing claims. We want, as a reader, to be swayed, to end the reading saying, yes, that's true, or now I know that, or aha, I have a new understanding. So it's the authority, that claims are made with authority. It looks very different in different disciplines. In some cases, you may indeed insert yourself through I or we. In other cases, you may not include yourself at all and use passive voice. But in all cases, regardless, it's not your opinions, it's not your beliefs that will make your claims powerful. It's the authority with which you make them, which relates to the disciplinary norms, and importantly, it relates to the kinds of evidence that you give your reader to substantiate your claims. I don't think many supervisors in the more abstract end of knowledges like chemistry, physics, or mathematics, I don't think those supervisors talk about strong voice. But there is voice, even in those fields. There's voice in all fields. If you understand voice, as I'm suggesting, as being the disciplinary authority of making claims that can convince your reader, that's voice. But it will look very, very different in different fields. So there is such a thing as a wrong voice, and a wrong voice is when you're just sharing your opinions. I think that we should look at what students are learning and also at who they are. I believe that both of these are important. So here's an example of someone just sharing their views. I think that we should look at what students are learning and also at who they are. I believe that both of these are important. Who cares? Why should I care what you think? Well, that's problematic voice. And then I'm going to suggest that there's a whole range of different voices. There's a voice that you can use through a direct quote, which is kind of where the author is absent. So let's have a look at that first one. LCT, that stands for Legitimation Code Theory. Legitimation Code Theory allows analysis to see both knowledge and knowers. LCT concepts bring knowledge practices into view and enable their forms to be analysed in relation to students' dispositions. Maton and Chen, 2020, page 36. Nothing wrong with that. You're making a claim. But you're making a claim actually by handing the microphone over to these other people, Maton and Chen. It's in inverted commas. You're letting them speak. So you're joining the conversation. You are the one writing the text. But you're doing so by simply handing the mic and suddenly letting someone else talk. Nothing wrong with using a direct quote, but I think you need to minimize the extent to which you use them, because every time you use a direct quote, you're letting someone else talk into the microphone, and so your voice as the author is absent. Let's have a look at a slightly different version, where the author's voice is slightly stronger. It's not absent, it's actually present, but it's still pretty weak. So here they are paraphrasing that quote. They say, Maton and Chen, 2020, page 36, assert that legitimation code theory is useful because it allows us to analyze both knowledge and knowers, and the LCT concepts enable us to view knowledge practices and their forms. Bit better, you're not handing over the microphone to Maton and Chen. You're holding the microphone now, but instead of telling me what you're claiming, you're telling me what they said. You're telling me what Maton and Chen said. You're summarizing and paraphrasing what they said. So although I'm hearing you talking into the microphone, I'm not hearing your claims. Let's have a look at the third example, which is one with the same example, but now with a strong voice. A focus on both knowledge and knowers is needed. Maton and Chen, 2020. And the LCT concepts used in this study enable an analysis of knowledge practices and their forms in relation to the student participants. This is much stronger. In this one, you can hear my voice. I'm the one making the claim. I'm saying that a focus on knowledge and knowers is needed. I'm no longer letting Maton and Chen talk. I'm not handing them the microphone, and I'm not telling you about their views. I'm saying it. I'm telling you, dear reader, that you better believe me, that a focus on knowledge and knowers is needed. Oh, you don't believe me? Okay. Well, here's a reference. Go and check this reference out, because this reference will show you that in a previous peer-reviewed article, evidence is provided for the claim that I am now making in my writing. So in this way, the reference is used to add evidence to the claim that I am making. So that's, I'd say, the most powerful. You need to bear in mind that all three of these is fine. None is wrong. And you might, in a piece of writing, have a bit of absent voice, a bit of weak voice, and a bit of strong voice. But you do need to make sure that at least some of the time you have a strong voice. In other words, for at least some of the time, and preferably a lot of the time, it is you as the author who is making the claims. Your reader wants to hear what you are claiming. And they need to see evidence that you draw on to support your claims. So don't just summarize what others have said. You make the claim, you state the facts, and then use the reference as evidence to support me. So you say, dear reader, XYZ is true. Oh, you don't believe me? Check out these names in brackets at the end of my sentence, because those dudes support the claim that I am making. Here's some additional materials that you may find useful from the postgraduateenvironments.com website. Thank you for listening.